Hello artists and welcome to your intro to watercolor lesson. Let's talk about what you're going to need to have to paint today. So first you're going to need some paper, and I probably told you what kind of paper to use, so make sure you check that out with me. Second, you're going to need some paint. As you can see, I have my fancy watercolor paints here. You don't need anything this fancy, I promise. You guys have a more limited palette, and that one's actually going to work great because it really helps you with learning how to mix colors. You're going to need your brushes. I've got my whole set here, and you guys are going to need your whole set as well. Don't just get out one brush. Eventually, you're going to need them all today. And if we have paint, paper, brushes, what else do we need for watercolor? Water, hello. Water is extremely important when you're working with watercolor. And so I like to use two water cups, one for washing my brushes and one for clean, clear water, because it's always good to have something to hydrate your paint or to hydrate your paper. So I just like to use these disposable cups and keep those clear. You can tell this one's been used a lot for rinsing brushes and this one hasn't, just based on their colors. Okay, you're also going to need some paper towels. It's always good to have these handy to dip your brush on if it gets too much paint on it. Or sometimes I use like an old t-shirt as a rag for this purpose as well. Now, those are all the must-haves. Now, here's some things that you could also use in addition today. And so I'm going to go ahead and show you what those are. You might want to use some saran wrap. So if you have a chunk of saran wrap you can get, that would be good. You'll definitely want to use some salt. So just grab a salt shaker. Masking tape, if you have that at home. I'm going to show you how to use something with this. I have the blue painter's tape. I think that regular masking tape, that's that kind of creamy white color, actually works better. So if you have that, that's great. If you have crayons at home, I'm going to teach you something with that. Or the step up is oil pastels, but either one should work. Not chalk pastels though, it has to be oil pastels. So if it's got like a chalky substance to it, like sidewalk chalk would, don't use that kind. And then the last thing is some rubbing alcohol. Or you could also use hand sanitizer. I know these things are kind of precious right now, but if you've got some to spare, there's some cool techniques I can show you with that. All right, so to get started, I'm gonna first show you a technique that works really well for when you're doing backgrounds or filling in any kind of big space. So I wanna use my biggest brush. I think you guys might have one a little bit smaller, a bigger brush for covering a lot of space. And so we're talking backgrounds, it's gonna be a bigger area. I'm gonna start with my clean water here, and I'm just going to fill in with clean water, just plain water, the area that I want to fill in. All right, now it's time for a color. I think I'm gonna go with red. Let's do some red. I'm gonna take my red into my water, and I'm trying to create what's called a wash. A wash is when you want one space filled in all the same color. And with the wash, it actually kind of helps to pick up your paper and let gravity kind of do its thing and control where the paint is going. Especially when you start to get these areas that kind of build up. If you get areas that are full of too much paint, here's a spot you want to use your paper towel to kind of blot some of that out. So that is called a wash. All right, now kind of going off of the wash, notice how light this color is. That's because I put the water down first and diluted it. And when you're working with watercolor, it's super important to work light and then go dark. You never want to start with your dark colors. In fact, black paint, don't use it until you think you're done with your painting. So always start with your light colors first. So how do I change the value of my paint? Well, the more paint and less water, the darker it is. But when there's more water and less paint, the lighter it is. So this time I'm going to try to create a a wash that doesn't already have water down first. See how that's so much darker? And what I want to do is make this into a gradient. I want to change from that red-orange color into orange. Notice how I just paint right into it. And maybe I want to go further and head into a yellow. Voila, this is a gradient. I've gone from one color to the next. Just put a lowercase I in the middle of a word. I hate that. All right, gradient, or like an ombre. And you can actually kind of do that with just a single color as well. You can go from one value to the next. So I'm going to try it now with changing values in my paint. I'm going to add more water as I go. And notice how now I have changed values in my wash. So this is what's called a gradated wash. Oh man, I might spell this wrong. Gradated. I think there's a good chance I spelled that word wrong. I'll let you know. So this is, think of it as like a value scale. And this can be used to paint lots of different forms as well. So say I now want to try painting like a sphere. Before, by the way, I was painting with a flat brush. Flat brushes really help you get larger areas. I'm going to try now my round brush to draw a little bit more with my paint. So I'm going to try creating a sphere. And I'm gonna have the light coming from the right side. So I'm going to let the paint get lighter as it goes to the right. So see how I'm adding more water now? I'm not dipping my paintbrush back into the paint, I'm dipping it into the water. Always start light. And voila. And after this dries, I might decide it needs to be a little darker. I'll come back and layer on. When you're working with watercolor, it's always better just start really light, but you can always come back and do more layers. Let's kind of clean up these edges, make it a little bit more spherical. All right. I think I'm going to try a cube also so you can see how that looks. So I actually just noticed myself making kind of a mistake with the brush. You might notice that as I'm painting, I try to take the strokes all in the same direction and I pick up the paintbrush each time between strokes. What you don't want to do, what I accidentally just did, is to scrub with it like this, like you would a marker. This does a lot of bad things. One, it ruins your brush because eventually your brush will be all flat out and destroyed from scrubbing like that. The second thing that it does is it eventually balls up your paper. And so if I were to continue scrubbing like that, my paper would start to rip. So it's really important that you treat the paper very gently as you go. If you find yourself scrubbing like that, make yourself stop and start picking up the paintbrush. I have an annoying little song to make you stop scrubbing and you'll hate to hear it, so don't make me tell you. So I'm gonna tell you now, so you don't have to imagine. You'll imagine me singing this anytime you do it. Scrubs, I don't want no scrubs. Scrubs is the way you ruin your brushes from me. Going with the bristles out to the side. Okay, I had more to it and I forgot. But that's how you ruin your brushes. Okay, so One thing that's really tricky with watercolors is that you have to be patient. So I like really want to keep painting on my what's going to be a cube right now, but I know if I start drawing the next side, it's going to bleed into it. In fact, why don't I show you what's going to happen there if I were to not be patient? And I'm going to start doing the top of my cube. Draw this in here. Gonna need some more water because this is our lighter spot. And now they've bled together, so I can't really control this value anymore. Might be a little easier if I showed you that with a different color. It's all just bleeding together. So you gotta be patient and wait for things to dry before you do the next part that's touching. This side was more dry, so that's gonna allow me to work. All right, so this is using value. My sphere up here is starting to dry a little bit, so I'm gonna add another layer on here now so that I can start to get this one looking a little bit more spherical. Notice I'm kind of like dabbing as I paint rather than long strokes. When I'm trying to fill in little tedious spots like this, it helps to control by more dabbing like that. I'm adding more water so I can try to even this out. All right, there's my sphere. Okay, so that's your basic intro things. We've got a gradient, gradated wash that I probably spelled wrong, a wash, and kind of applying different value ranges to your work. Along with that we talked about is layering. Always layer, be patient. Okay, let's try a new one now. So I'm gonna show you one of the most fun techniques, I think, and this is called wet into wet. So I'm gonna start with, well, I'll show you two different ways. You could do this with just water. So I'm gonna start with my clean water and just paint some of my clean water on here. Switching back to my round brush. I'm gonna go for some purple. Now, right into my wet paint, I can just dab and allow the paint to kind of do its thing in the water. It just, let paint be paint, let it spread out, kind of move the page around, let gravity kind of take this on and change things with it. Or I could do wet into wet with paint. So I'm going to try some with some blue here. And back to my purple, I'm going to let the purple intermingle with the blue. And that is called wet into wet. Contrary to the wet and wet, we also can do wet on dry. So I'm gonna come back to my wash now, and I'm gonna maybe switch to a little bit smaller brush. Now, wet on dry is when you're working with wet paint on a dry surface. So now that my wash is dried, I am going to paint on top of it. I'm always really drawn to flowers when working with watercolor. Probably kind of basic, but whatever. So I've got my wet paint, and I'm going to paint on top of this. Now I'm not going super wet here. If the paint were too wet, then I wouldn't have any control over it. Like this one, I started to get a little too much water on that last petal there. Well, that was supposed to be a flower. Guess it kind of looks like one. Maybe I can get all fancy and do some wet into wet on my wet on dry. Oh yeah. Add some color into those petals. All right, so that is wet on dry. Okay. One more trick I'm going to show you before I end this video and go on to the next one is what's called dry brush. So with the dry brush, contrary to the last ones we just looked at where you have a lot of water, with the dry brush, you don't want to have a lot of water, just a little bit, just enough to hydrate your paint. So I'm just gonna hydrate my green here I'm using a small brush this time. I want to get some texture going. I am going to come and add, oh, that wasn't quite enough water. I'm gonna come back and add some little leaf type things around my flowers here. And so these come out a bit darker because there's less water. It's more pigmented with the paint. And as I'm doing these brush strokes, I press at the beginning and then I lift off the paper, and that's how it gets that sharp point at the end. Ta-da! So that is dry brush. All right, that's the end of part 1. Part 2, we'll use all that fancy extra stuff I told you to get.